started out, we've tried to establish a baseline of definitions because we want to make sure that we're operating from the same definition. So when you think about anger, what is anger from a clinical perspective? And Callie, we'll start with you. What is anger from a clinical perspective?
From a clinical perspective, it's probably similar to what we would all assume it is. It's just this feeling of, expressing rage, expressing, I don't know, I'm trying to think of what a clinical perspective of that would be, to be honest. Because when I think of it, I just think of the outward expression of feelings underneath. So that's what I would call it, but we'll go into that more in a little bit. Morgan, do you have anything to add?
Anger is simply an emotion. That is it. So from a clinical perspective, it's an emotion.
But oftentimes when we talk about anger as an emotion, we talk about it in a way in which we view it as negative.
So it is often viewed as negative because what people are actually viewing as negative is the outward expression of anger that may be negative, but the emotion itself is not. So anger can have very motivating factors. There's actually a lot of studies in sports. If somebody purposely gets fouled in a basketball game before they end up having to get a free throw shot, they are more likely to score a free throw after getting fouled and angry than they are if they just walked up and threw a free shot. So a free throw, right? So it can be a very powerful motivator to get you to do something, to drive you, to have something to focus on because you want to prove something. So anger can be helpful, but it can also be the negative connotation, and it's all about how that anger is actually expressed, is how people would view it as negative or not negative. But in and of itself, anger is simply an emotion or reaction to something.
Callie, anything that you would add to that?
Yeah, we can look at anger, and we see it even in Scripture, that it is not a bad thing. It is a God-given emotion, and so we can assume all the time, because it is such a strong reaction and a strong feeling, and often the outward expression, as Morgan said, is typically, it can be a little more explosive sometimes, depending on how we harness it, and it's not always harnessed for good, and so it can look like it's negative, but it's actually, it's not a bad thing or a good thing necessarily. It is just an emotion, and that's something, hopefully, as we go through tonight and the rest of, you guys go through the rest of these, the series, we realize that emotions are neither good nor bad. They are just emotions, so that we can remove the shame from that. And I think there's a lot of shame underneath anger that can be looked at as negative, and it is not. It's, like Morgan said, it propels us forward a lot of times if we handle it in the right way.
So, Callie, are there health consequences to anger? And what are some of those that you may have seen and may have experienced?
Yeah, as far as physical health, we can obviously know that there are many, given just the stress that anger can sometimes induce. And so there's, the heart disease. It can lead to compromised immune system. Just whenever you think of the physical health aspect, it's going to lead to more stress. And so it's definitely something that impacts that. Then coming from a relational background, I often think of the relational consequences and the relational issues that come from that as far as health. And so a lot of times our relationships, depending again how we utilize anger in our lives, that can also be impacted in regard to, of course, whether that's between spouses or friends or parent-child relationships. Those are often impacted and can sometimes be, either propelled in a good way or in a bad way. And so that's what I often see is the relational impact more so than the physical health aspect.
And the physical health aspect for anger is also over long term. So when you look at people who have long-term anger or chronically held hostility, you do see there are studies that have indicated upwards of 2 times the volume of heart disease and heart attack risk, stroke risk, insomnia. But additionally, there's been some studies that have showed long-term hostility and anger has also caused inflammation in lungs and causes long-term breathing issues and respiratory issues.
So, Morgan, are there different types of anger?
It's more different. expressions of anger.
Okay.
So I think on Sunday it was mentioned people can repress anger and that people can express anger. So anger as an emotion itself is, anger is simply an emotion. There's a lot of things that lead up to anger, and there's a lot of things that come after anger. So if you think about it, the way people actually express anger is only one part. So anger has, she's going to talk a little bit about, kind of what's underneath anger, but there is a natural buildup. So you can look and Google this expression, but anger is a moral emotion. So anger is often something that comes out of it being against what you personally believe. So if you want a word to attach to it, the word should is often a word that's going to probably tie into something about anger. He should not have said that. I should have gotten a job. I should have gotten that promotion. She should have been nicer to me. When you look at the word should, you often see that is something that you believe and have a strong belief in. And when something contradicts your belief, it's more likely to then trigger you to have an anger response. So there's always an event that happens, and then there is your interpretation of that event, and then you begin experiencing anger, and then you express in one way or another anger, and then you have after effects of anger, which could be consequences of anger, or could just be your body calming down from another way. So if you think about anger in terms of different types, anger as an emotion, there's not different types of the emotion, but there are a lot of different types along the way that you can interpret an event and you can express the anger. And I think the way you worded it on Sunday was really good. You have people who repress and stuff down their anger, and you have people who physically or verbally or kind of explode that anger. Both of them are the same emotion. It's just how that person is choosing to express it.
Callie, you are going to walk us through a little bit of a graphic that's going to come up on the screen. And turn it over to you. Let's talk about the Anger Iceberg.
Yes, this is such a great graphic, and I use it often. So often we can think that, as Morgan was saying, that there's like a situation or a person that is causing our anger, when in actuality, it's usually a belief, it is other emotions and things like that. So as you can see on the iceberg, you see that the top part of the iceberg is anger. We only see the first 20% of what's actually going on. And the bigger part, which is the 80% below the surface, is what's actually going on. So that could be depression, anxiety, as we've already talked about, hurt, fear, frustration, shame, disappointment, embarrassment. There's so many things that are going to cause our then outward expression of those things. And because anger is so fast, and I think, you guys addressed that so well scripturally and everything on Sunday about anger, when we're in the process of it, needs to be slowed down. And because it goes so fast, we're so quick to blame that we often don't look below the surface to name what is actually going on. And so if we can do that and slow down, it allows us to name it, which allows us to have the ability to deal with it in a better way. And so the Anger Iceberg is just a great graphic to utilize and recognize how easy it is to project and show anger, but what's actually going on underneath is what needs to be addressed even more.
One of the things that I would add to that too with the iceberg is the reason why. So you have people who have depression and anxiety like we talked about in previous weeks. While anger is not, everyone looks at it as anger is bad or anger is wrong, anger is also the most socially acceptable emotion to share. So it's one that people feel more comfortable, even though they think it's bad or wrong. It's more comfortable to see or express that I'm angry than I am deeply wounded or I am traumatized. And I don't know how to react to that. So it's a lot easier for me to react in anger, or I feel out of control and I have anxiety, and it's a lot easier for me to react in anger because it's a brief moment of control that I have. It's not control if you think about it, but when you're in that state and mind, it's more acceptable to lash out or to be angry. And it's often, like we talk about it in families, how many times people have heard the story, right? You get mad at work, and so you come home and you yell at your spouse or you yell at your kid. Well, it's also a huge way of, it's easier to be angry than to say, hey, I had a really bad day at work. But it's also easier to be angry with those people who you trust as safe people than it is to still spread vulnerable emotions. So that's why anger is often at the top of that iceberg, is because people accept seeing anger a little bit more than people accept seeing vulnerability.
So when you talk about those different expressions, and I appreciate what you said about that, how do those expressions manifest themselves in family units, children, teens, adults?
You want to take family units first?
Sure. Yeah, so, I mean, I think everybody can think about when they have their teenager, mostly. I usually work with teens, and so I'll kind of handle that aspect. And the frustration that can come about because, the teenager isn't doing something or they're not listening and things like that. We can often, what I notice the most is it's a lack of empathy and compassion to the teen. And so we'll find that the parents will sometimes get angry at the child, or the teenager will get angry at the parent because, again, they're just, a lot of times it's because they don't always know what they're feeling or what they want to express on either side, for parent and for children and their teenagers and things like that. And so obviously within the family unit, you just see it can lead to a lot of contention when it's not utilized properly. And so, just lost my train of thought there. But it's one of the things that I was thinking of as we were going through this is how we can often escalate, and how in family units, especially if one person is modeling how they handle their emotions, the children are going to follow suit a lot of times. And so if the parent escalates, or if the child is escalating and the parent also escalates, you're going to keep in this power struggle that eventually you guys are both out of control. And so it's really important, especially as the parents, I would encourage, because you're the model most likely, is to maintain that composure so that we're not also escalating and raising the barometer of emotion and that power struggle. And I know that can be difficult, and self-soothing is important in that, but and we can always talk about that in the future. But that's one of the ways that I see the issues in the family, and you can, of course, add more to that.
I would say for little kids, right, you see anger a lot of the same ways as you see it in adult, right? That's why adults are often referred to as looking like a kid throwing a tantrum when they're when they're angry, because it is seen in the same way. So, right, you have adults and kids who both express anger, physically yelling, throwing things, that type of stuff. You also have kids and adults who show it through repression, sulking, silent treatment, crying. All of that can also happen with anger as well. One of the most important things I think I would encourage parents to be mindful of with kids, a lot of times anger, right, iceberg, for adults, it's emotions underneath too that we're not handling or dealing with like we need to. But for kids, they don't actually have the words to identify what they're feeling. And so one of the biggest things that I would encourage is, we spend a lot of time as parents, and I have a little one, and I am guilty of this myself, even though I'm telling you guys, right? But we spend a lot of times focusing on the behavior after the anger instead of focusing on what caused the anger. And so what we teach kids to do, we don't mean to, but what we end up teaching kids to do is, hey, don't hit if you're angry, but we don't teach them, like, why did you feel angry? Or what is the feeling that made you angry? And when we don't teach kids why they're angry, or we don't help them identify the feelings underneath the anger, what we teach them is it's not okay to express anger, but you can feel it. And then they chronically feel like they're just an angry child. And then they grow up to feel like they just have an anger problem, or they're just an angry person. But instead, they don't still have the words to actually identify the anger. So spending a lot of time, it's very important to set boundaries, but spending a lot of time trying to process the why. So you can obviously set boundaries You can say, hey, I understand that you're angry, but it's not okay to hit so-and-so, or it's not okay to punch a wall, whatever it might be. But you also can talk about the feelings beneath it, because the quicker a child can identify additional feelings that they're feeling that's motivating the anger, number one, they're more likely to stop having the negative expressions of anger and be able to talk, but also they grow up into healthier adults who can manage anger, because it doesn't go away. And so that would be one. But the escalation, there was, when I was doing play therapy and a lot of family work, one of the biggest sentences that has stuck with me, and I say it at home, and my husband has to remind me of it too, but parents should be a thermostat and not a thermometer. Yes. Right? We set the tone in which we respond to people instead of reacting to the tone in which we're responding to people. It works for more than just parents. Fill in any adult, right? But if we are responding and I'm going to set that this is the tone I'm talking to, handles a lot better. And so especially with kids, especially with little kids, teaching them the underneath, that why they feel angry, what caused that anger, and other ways to handle it is so much longer in the long run of having them grow up and understanding that anger is okay. And you don't have to be angry. There are ways to handle it and deal with it instead of just stopping the behavior and not handling the emotion.
Yeah, the one thing I would add, it's basically just summing up to, I guess, what you just said, is the importance of validating the emotion rather than going straight to the correction. I have this thing, I think I got it from the Gottman Institute, connect and then correct. And so, like Morgan's saying, help them understand the why, help them understand the emotion underneath, validate. I can see you're frustrated. That sounds so agitating. I'm sure that was very scary, but we still don't hit people or we still don't act in that way, because that's gonna help you connect with them a lot. It's a lot deeper. It's gonna enhance attachment and that emotional connection with your child. And then they're gonna feel more safe and connected to you and know you're a safe person to go to when I'm feeling angry, when I'm feeling upset, when my wounds come up. You're safe, and they'll be able to communicate that a lot better. So correct, or connect and then correct.
So are there different stages, Morgan, of anger?
Not really different stages as much as kind of that pattern, right? So there is an event, I interpret that event, and then I, experience anger, and then I express anger. And how everyone does that is very different, but the pattern is almost identical for almost every single anger episode. And it is very fast, so you have to be very mindful of it. And sometimes you don't catch yourself until the expression of said anger. And then you have to work on backing up and figuring out how to, apologize or other things that might be warranted. But a lot of anger, when people go and get help with focusing on anger, is actually a lot of work focused on what's causing the root problem of the anger. It's usually very often not the initial event that makes someone angry. It usually is rooted in a lot of other things happening.
What's the difference then between anger and aggression?
So I'll start with this one. So there is a very big difference between anger and aggression. There is a statistic out there that shows that only about 10% of anger actually ends in aggression. So if you think of that, 90% of anger is other forms of handling anger, whether it be yelling or something like that. But actual physical aggression is a very small physical display of anger. There is a very large difference between saying someone has an anger problem and saying someone has an aggression issue. And I think there's some more questions we'll talk about and get into it, but there is a very clear delineation that anger is not aggression. Aggression can be a display of anger, but the aggression is also a display of multiple other things.
Yeah, it's kind of like what we said before about anger being the emotion and the moral, that moral aspect, whereas aggression is typically a physical thing that you can see more so. And again, not all anger means aggression, and so that's important to remember as well.
So October is Domestic Violence Awareness Month all across the country. So what is the tie to anger, aggression, and domestic violence?
So there is a little bit of a connection. It's often, I think, misconnected a lot more frequently than it is actually connected. So a lot of people think that someone who is a batterer or is in domestic violence situation, they often think that that means that person has an anger problem. And it's often very much not the case. So domestic violence, someone who is physically abusing someone, that is a belief of a power and control issue. They believe they have the right to have power and control in a situation. Whereas most people who would say, I have an anger management problem, it is a lack of control that is expressing negative signs of anger. And so, there are people who think, oh, if someone has been in domestic violence, they just need to go to anger management. That's actually contraindicated. Like, you should not do that because there is such a difference. Someone who is a batterer, it is a belief. And again, anger management is anger being the outward expression, how they're expressing it, and it is much more about the emotion and a behavior that's happening than the belief. And so there is a very big difference, but it's often tied together because you look at anger and people think anger equals aggression. But there is a very delineated group for domestic violence, that it has nothing to do with just a lack of control, because somebody who is a batterer can listen to their boss all day long and they can control it in that situation. They choose to unleash or have a domestic violence incident when they choose to control it, instead of a lack of control because it's just an anger outburst that they couldn't stop.
Callie?
I mean, honestly, I think that covered the majority of what I know also about it, is that when we think anger, it's more in powerlessness. And obviously both require a lack of safety. Because when I think anger, I can sometimes think lack of safety, but it all depends on how you harness it, right? And in domestic violence situations, safety is, of course, the number one thing as far as victims go, or survivors even, I should say. And so, of course, we want to get them, obviously, the best help possible. But yeah, there is a very big difference, and it's not necessarily causation. So one does not equal the other. And I think that's important to drive home, as Morgan said. Yeah.
The only thing I would say, since we have the platform, is that there are resources available. So on the website, in the crisis resources available, there's a 24/7 hotline for domestic violence resources across the country that you can contact. If you're in Mecklenburg County, Safe Alliance is the domestic violence program that operates 24/7. If you're in South Carolina, Safe Passage. But there is one in every county. They have very trained and specialized people to help the survivors for domestic violence, but they can also link for people and resources for finding batterer intervention groups as well.
So how would someone de-escalate a friend or a family member during an anger incident? Morgan?
I'm laughing because my first response is don't. Walking away is often the best tool that you can use, and it sounds really silly, and it's very hard to do, but I do want to call, before I talk a little bit more seriously about de-escalation, is if you are in a domestic violence situation, I want to make a very strong call out that is not a time to be de-escalating a situation, right? Domestic violence has a level of safety that needs to be addressed. That is not a de-escalation moment. That is not something that you should be trying to calm down. That is a safety issue that needs to be addressed from a safety standpoint. And so I just want to highlight that especially. But if you're talking de-escalation for kids, teenagers, family members, I have done a lot of therapy groups in which kids tell me, well, counting to 10 doesn't work. And I go, I agree. So, right, as it is with every coping skill we've talked about, different things work for different people, okay? So one of the biggest across the board, though, and I struggle significantly with this, I will admit, is walking away. I feel like I need to say something in that moment or talk it out, and that is not wise at all. You do need time. You need time. That person needs time. So what I do recommend is in situations, right? You're an adult, you're in your marriage, whatever it might be. If you need time, you don't just walk away. Sometimes you need to address why. So if someone just walks away in the middle of an argument, to me, it makes me a little bit more mad. And so making sure that you're communicating. So, right, I need to take time and I'm going to walk away. Even if it's the other person having the anger outburst, it is perfectly okay for you to say, I need to walk away, and walk away. Remove yourself from the situation. Remove yourself from the computer and keyboard that you are at. Do not respond. Walk away. There is a great volume in simply distancing yourself from whatever it is that is making you angry. That will allow you some space to be able to calm down, right? Anger is fast. If you don't immediately react, you have the time to figure out other better, healthy ways to react. So whether it is walking physically away, whether it is hanging up a phone call, whether it is turning off social media, right? It's a moral, so it's getting at what you believe should happen, which means, guess what? There are a lot of other people with what they believe should happen. Talking those out when you are heated is not suggested in any way. So I can certainly share more, I'll let you jump in, but that would be the first one, is either you as the person who's angry or you as the person who sees someone else as angry, giving space to allow someone to kind of calm down.
Yeah, I would just drive that point home definitely, because you know, a lot of times when we're angry, when we get flooded and those defenses come up, it's no longer about us. I'm speaking more so if you're in a conversation with a person and we get angry, right? It's no longer about us or having a civil conversation at times. It can be about protecting what I don't want you to see. Like we said, anger is the thing that's seen, underneath is what is unseen. And so because I'm so adamant to protect myself and defend, and so defensiveness can get in there, and then we don't take responsibility for what is ours, walking away and being able to, you know, grasp what it is that I'm actually feeling versus attacking is so helpful. And it may not feel like that in the moment, especially if we have anxious attachment. And I don't know if any of you guys know much about attachment, but if we're an anxious attachment type, like, we want to fix it, right? And sometimes we're not going to fix it when we're escalated to that point. And it is best just to walk away and then, and of course, communicate that in a safe way with whomever we're, you know, having that conversation with or having that disagreement with, and then using whatever self-soothe tools we can to de-escalate ourselves, and to self-soothe, whether that's finding some level of healthy distraction is really good, and to not think about what we were just arguing about, but to distract, to let our bodies physiologically calm down. Because usually, I'm sure you guys know, physically, obviously, our hearts are pounding, our body temperature has risen, and so if we can calm that down, and then we can think through later about, you know, the actual thing, and we can problem solve them a lot better when our emotion isn't driving the car, but more so we're in more control. So.
Additionally, I think you have a lot of ability to, you know, if you are living with someone or walking alongside someone and you know that person has depression or anxiety or trauma, you know, it's very easy. I think the words that Callie used, right? Connecting to them and validating that emotion. So, right, hey, I get that you're really upset about this. You don't always have to say, I get that you're mad. Like, if you know why, the root cause of why they are, actually identifying that works great with kids, but guess what? It works great with adults too. Like, hey, I get that really hurt your feelings, or that really undermined you, right? If you identify what it is that actually caused that anger emotion, that often has such a connected power to that individual that it can help with that de-escalation, because they can go, hey, you're right, I'm not really angry. I'm actually upset, or I feel disrespected, or whatever else it might be. And so it works, especially if you know that person has a known history with depression, anxiety, and trauma, because usually, right, that's what's pushing and motivating. But any form of connection, if you know a little bit more, if you're living life with someone or alongside someone, you know a little bit more about why that incident usually affected them the way it did. So validating that emotion to that person is extremely powerful in helping them de-escalate. My 6-year-old is very good at telling me exactly his word choice, and it doesn't offend you, right? So tonight, before I left, my husband goes, "I'm sorry you're sad," and he goes, "I'm not sad, I'm frustrated." That's fine if you guess the wrong emotion, because the person can usually still identify the correct one, even if it's not anger. Works for kids, works for adults, because again, anger's that top part. So if you identify the emotion that's actually underneath, you're a lot closer to being able to de-escalate a situation of anger than you are if you just say, "Hey, yeah, you're really mad." And also, don't say calm down.
No.
It doesn't work. It doesn't work for anxiety. It doesn't work for anger. They will calm down when they're ready to, but other things are a lot more appropriate. But identifying the actual other feeling that might be behind the anger is a really useful tool in de-escalation.
So we're living in a pandemic, and tensions are high, and we've talked about it almost every session about what the impact of COVID and maybe people feeling a little bit more angry or a little bit more frustrated, and anger is showing. What are the things that you would say, or would there be the steps that would be different if there was an anger incident that you were experiencing from someone you didn't know?
Well, I think social media has shown us that's happening all the time and everywhere. There are a lot of people I don't know who are making comments that I don't like, but remember, anger is going back to that moral. It's something that I don't morally agree with or I don't believe. So it's really hard for a person to change their beliefs, right? Once I believe something, it can change, but it's very hard to change. So if I believe that the sky is blue, and I have believed that the sky is blue my entire life, and now all of this information comes out that the sky is really purple, I'm not going to quickly change my belief that the sky is blue. I've lived my whole life believing that the sky is blue. So the more people tell me the sky is purple, I am more likely to go, "You're wrong," and get very annoyed and agitated. So at this point in my speech, you probably all are thinking of some hot topic that you have now seen on social media that is the exact same, right? Fill in the blanks: religion, politics, science, medicine, school, doesn't matter. Fill in the blanks with any word. And anytime you see things or hear repeatedly information that is against what you believe, you are more likely to become angry. So if you find yourself on certain websites or certain news sites or certain social media apps, and you continuously feel that you are getting angry, it is a sign that you should probably stop reading or going to those sites, because all it's really doing is feeding that desire. You want to read more, and then when you get angry, then you try and look for other things to prove how you're right, and then you go down a rabbit hole. Because then you're reading more and more things that are contradicting you, and you're trying more and more to find things that you agree and support with, and it just continues in a cycle. So in the pandemic, in the past year, in American culture and society today, we're constantly seeing more information than we ever have before. And the speed of that information, we've talked about this every week, we weren't designed to have that much information. Our body, our mind, our ability to process that much information, it wasn't created that way. And so the more we are feeding it, there are people that should get off of social media and stop reading the news and delete apps, because if it is driving you to chronically and constantly feel angry, or feel the need to chronically and constantly express that anger, it is not healthy. Also, if you are feeling that level of anger, even if you never respond or say anything publicly, you're still allowing yourself to be in a situation where you're chronically feeling that anger. Repression of anger, we've talked a lot about the expression of anger. Repression of anger is just as harmful to your body. Repression of anger leads to increases of depression. Repression of anger leads to increased levels of anxiety, increased levels of insomnia. So thinking I'm not responding to it, but I'm going to read there, and then you sit fuming with it, has the same level of consequences and harm to your body and mental state that then just yelling at someone has. It does the same thing. It's just a matter of how you're expressing it. So in today's society, there's a lot of things, but if you're constantly reading or being inundated with news or information out there that is keeping you in a state of anger, I would highly encourage you to look at whether or not you need to continue those or whether or not you can step away.
Hear, hear.
I am off
Good.
my soapbox now.
That needed to be said. Yes.
Well, we're going to have one more question for our panel, and then let me remind you to be sure to be texting your questions in, and we'll start those in just a moment. But Callie, what are some of the most effective treatments and coping mechanisms for those who wish to control their anger better?
Yeah, well, there's a lot. And like we said earlier, Morgan alluded to this, that it really depends on the person. For some people, again, and it really depends too on when you're catching it in that anger cycle. Is it at the trigger stage? Is it at the expression stage? Is it in the recovery stage? Like, again, there's not necessarily certain stages, but the places that Morgan was alluding to before. But it's good to have both proactive and retroactive coping skills, I noticed. So the proactive ones would be the ways in which I'm releasing some of the stress, the anxiety, all the stuff that's underneath the anger. How am I managing that in my day-to-day, right? So whether that's, keeping up with our sleep, our diet, our exercise, making sure we're taking care of our bodies, those are some good proactive ones. And then also having in your toolbox those retroactive ones of, when I have gotten angry and I'm, in the aftermath of it, or I get triggered and I'm realizing it's good to notice your triggers. So notice, when is my heart rate increasing? When, there's certain feelings that we can sometimes get. When am I starting to get more tense? So when we can notice those, we're going to be better able to cope with them. And so whether that's, also breathing techniques, there's many different ones out there, but the moral of it is you breathe. Counting sometimes works, sometimes it doesn't. It's usually not effective for me personally. Typically just having your own space is usually good, and you can, if you're more of an outward expresser of anger, it's good to have some ones that are calming. So some meditation, some praying, just, things that are more mental to calm the mind and calm the body. For those that tend to repress, I like to have them think of healthy, of course, ways to physically get out their anger. So again, maybe more an intense exercise. So maybe like a HIIT training or a kickboxing, something to harness the anger in a healthy way versus it coming out in a way in which you are not prepared for. You can even scream into a pillow. It just really depends on who you are and, just again, how you are feeling and experiencing your anger. So
I'd add a couple of things to that. So other things you can do kind of at home, I think Jonathan mentioned this, but when you write, yes. So if you are angry and you write, not only does it slow down your thinking, you can literally feel when you write, you will start writing more tense, but it's actually doing something good for your body because it's releasing physical tension. Mm-hmm. So writing is a really good one. I know it sounds silly. You can also write whatever you would like to say, and no one has to read it because you can then rip it up. And then you get to say exactly what you wanted to say and not have any negative consequences. So that is another option. But in terms of, if it is beyond the point of being able to just manage things at home, I think there are some good points. Figuring out the root of why you are angry. So if your anger is coming from depression, if it's coming from trauma, if it's coming from anxiety, getting help for your trauma, anxiety, and depression will reduce the levels of anger. Because so we're going to talk about trauma coming up, but when you have someone who has been traumatized and anger is an expression, when you actually handle the trauma, it's rewiring the brain. And when it rewires the brain, it can reset how you are dealing with anger. So someone who has been traumatized, who always has viewed themselves as an angry person, when they go through trauma therapy, often is like, that wasn't my personality. It is a separation, and anger is one of the most common things that you can see decrease when you're actually treating the trauma. Another really good, there is a therapy out there, an evidence-based treatment called dialectical behavior therapy, which is really, really good because what it does is it's focusing the balance of something called wise mind and emotional mind. And it's helping you, how do you stay in the balance? It's perfectly healthy to have emotions. It's perfectly great to be calm and analytical. How do you live in the middle without living too much in one or the other, where you have no feeling or expression versus too much feeling and expression, and how do you balance it? So that's a really good one for people who are struggling with kind of staying in that calmer space and not staying in such an emotionally reactive space. But again, based on the cause of what's causing the anger, I think the treatment modalities are a lot different. But underlying any cause from depression, anxiety, trauma is going to naturally help improve some of the anger.
So, our first question, are some people more inclined to express anger than other people? My brother becomes more angry, far more than I do. Is this attributable to our different personalities?
It could be. So there's a couple of things. Some people are a little bit more prone to anger, but a lot of times the reason they're more prone to it is it's what they witnessed and experienced more as a child. So when you have someone, anger is a very visible emotion often because of those outward expressions. And when you have a child who grows up and that's what they see constantly, you have someone who believes that's normal and natural, and they can be a little bit more predisposed to expressing anger in the same way. But it's the same thing if you have a child whose parent represses holding down that anger and does things like silent treatment or sulking or things like that. The child is more likely to grow up and having a very similar expression of anger as well. I don't necessarily think it's always a personality thing, right? We do know people are sometimes more stubborn than others, or that might be true. And when you look at it as a moral, if they have more deeply seated beliefs one way or another, that may predispose them to having more anger. But I think a lot of it, there's a lot of elements that is environmental to anger, and how we witnessed it and experienced it as a child is how we often end up more or less expressing it or dealing with it as an adult.
So, Callie, when would one consider anger a mental health issue versus the emotion we all feel?
That's a really good question. I think when it is obviously causing, because it's going to come out in some way, especially, so if we repress it, for instance, because I think there's two ways you can look at this. If you're expressing your anger, and it's more inward, right? It's going to come out in some way. That stress is going to. And so when you're starting to feel the symptoms of that, or when your trauma or your depression, your anxiety, when that's becoming too much to manage, really, and usually when we are dealing with anger is kind of when it's a good time to recognize that if it is stemming from a below issue. When it comes to like more external expression, obviously we never want to get to a space where we are harming anybody. However, if, like we talked about with aggression, of course, when you're getting to aggression, we want to seek help at that point. But also, there's really nothing wrong with if you're feeling angry and you're wanting to process it a little more. You can always seek out help at any range of the time. But of course, there is healthy anger. It's more so when you feel like you are not in control of how you're managing it and how you're coping with it, that I would suggest reaching out for help. Or if there's any thoughts around hurting others or hurting self, definitely reach out. Because we obviously, with self-harm or, and again, harming others, aggression, we want to keep that in check and make sure that, everybody's safe. So that's what I would say.
Morgan, some persons seem to live in anger. Is that a mental health issue, or is it cause and effect of something larger?
So if you go back to the iceberg, it is often cause and effect. So anger is not a mental health diagnosis, right? There are a couple of mental health diagnoses out there that include information about anger, right? You have depression. One of the characteristics of depression has stuff about anger, right? Childhood diagnosis of conduct disorder, oppositional defiant disorder, disruptive mood dysregulation disorder. There are elements in mental health conditions that have attributes of anger. There's intermittent explosive disorder, but they're not just anger by itself. So it could be a sign, if someone is living in anger, that there may be another mental health condition going on, or a mental health condition that has a large element of anger within it. But just because someone's living in anger does not also mean it has to necessarily be another mental health issue. There could be other things going on. That's how they were raised. That's how they were responding. But I would say oftentimes people who are living in anger do probably have something else going on that's causing them to react constantly in that heightened state. So there's kind of, it's not a mental health diagnosis of its own, but it is often linked to, right, iceberg, a lot of other mental health related issues.
So, Morgan, I'm going to send this question to you. How can we help a child slow down the anger process so they can name what feelings are going on below the iceberg?
So there are some really great resources and books for kids on anger. Small group activities, but also individual. So if it's a child who has a lot of anxiety-related anger, there's a book called When My Worries Get Too Big, and it is a relaxation book for kids, and it addresses when it gets to the level of anger. And it also addresses the steps to take to reduce that anger. So there's a lot of good books on feelings. So if you're trying to help a kid and not escalating so high to the anger, you have to teach them feelings and sensations that go along with the emotion. A lot of kids don't know when my chest starts getting tighter and my hands start feeling funny, that's usually related to anxiety. They don't know that when, hey, I start kind of getting a little more proud and my shoulders start going back, I start feeling proud. So when you help kids learn to identify the physical connection to the emotion, you help kids be able to slow down. So there's a resource out there. There's a lot of great books. I know here I've provided Emily Sanchez some books, but there's some really great words. So one is focusing on helping someone identify the feelings, helping a kid identify the physical feeling tied to the emotion for all emotions, right? It helps with anger too. But also looking at it in terms, if you want to look at stages, right? I'm nervous, I'm anxious, it's building, I'm getting tight, and then I erupt and I feel like a volcano has gone off. And then helping them learn how to calm down. And it's grounding exercises, but When My Worries Get Too Big is a really great resource in order to look at those steps up and look at the steps down. But again, the biggest is the identification of feelings. How do you know what anger is? How does your body know what anger is? Helps them a lot of times in being able to recognize it and slow it down quicker because, right, your body reacts to it quicker than your brain does and able to connect that feeling.
So we'll have the last question from our audience for both of you. And Callie, we'll start with you. Can anger ever be a driving force for good?
I think it can, again, in the sense that it does propel forward a lot of time. It can be a good motivator, especially when it comes to those moral beliefs and everything. And so it can be a good driver in that sense. But again, it comes down to also what is driving ultimately. Am I letting the feeling drive me, or is this indicating to me what I'm passionate about and what I believe? And so again, I think it can be very good when it's indicating something about ourselves, because emotions and feelings, they're indicators, not dictators. So not letting anger drive, but letting it indicate something about myself can be beneficial, I think.
I agree. I would add a little bit to that. I think there's a little bit of risk when people talk about righteous anger and what is righteous, right? But in what Callie talked about, there are topics to me that I could go on a rant, and just talking about it makes me so angry. And it's topics around safety of children, foster care, right? I've worked in that field for a very long time. And I can get fueled with a level of anger that motivates me to do something about it and take action in a good way. And how do I get involved and how do I help, right? Because the thoughts of some of the stuff happening in injustice can fuel me to do something good. I think it's that balance of is it ruling the negative actions, I think is another thing. But it can be a great motivator. There's lots of examples out there of when it helps people focus and dive in and really invest and get passionate about something, can often be coming from a place where it was fueled by a feeling of anger or injustice, and that can be a good thing. And I liked the way you worded it, though, like not letting it dictate negatively, right? But letting it fuel us positively, I think, is a really good way to look at that.
Thank you all for your engagement with us tonight and your questions and your interest in this topic. We so much appreciate you joining us, and we'll be here next week as we have an opportunity to hear from a panel and talking about grief. And next week we're going to welcome Ann Kinlaw, Jessica Diller, Morgan Lavender will be back with us, and Ken Grano. So we are looking forward to having them with us and being able to have this conversation on grief. So if you've been blessed by tonight's presentation, let me encourage you to please visit our Facebook page and consider sharing it so that others can be blessed by this. Also, make sure that you're visiting our website for the resources we talked about earlier. And also, you can go to our website to get caught up on some of the teachings, some earlier teachings from this series about mental health and anxiety and depression and anger. And we are halfway through our series. So thank you for joining us tonight, and we appreciate you being with us. God bless.